Welcome in, everybody. Happy Monday. My name's Jason Priester, ClemsonInsider.com. Appreciate everybody that is tuning in or will tune in at some point. Fall camp is upon us. Practice gets started on Thursday. Um, you know, so instead of just hearing a bunch of stuff that coaches said or players said, like we've had the last 2 weeks, we will actually have some actual football, stuff that actually happens on the field to talk about, from here on out to the start of the season. Not a ton of questions surrounding Clemson, heading into camp. Not many position battles, a lot of experience returning, a lot of, all across the field, both sides of the ball. You got to replace Marcus Tate up front along that offensive line. Obviously, you got to replace Phil Maffa. That's been one of the biggest or hottest topics of discussion. The running back position. You seem to be loaded at wide receiver. You know, Brennan Stools moved on at tight end, but you got some dudes behind him you feel good about. The defensive line is just loaded. You got to feel, or at least I do, I feel pretty good about what you got at linebacker, assuming you don't get ravaged by injuries. And then I like what you've got on the back end. You got to replace R.J. Mickens, obviously, but I think you got some options back there that are capable of stepping up. A couple of guys that have been biding their time. So we can take this thing anywhere you want to go. To me, one of the biggest things that kind of came out of the ACC kickoff last week, just from the players and stuff. I'm not talking about some of the bigger stuff Dabo was talking about, just team-centric stuff where, hearing that Adam Randall's up to about 240, 235, 240 is what Cade said. And Peter Woods talking about how he's lost a significant amount of weight, and he looks better than I've ever seen him. You can tell he has been putting in some work. Said he's down to 309. And I think that's probably a really good weight for him. Him and DeMonte Capehart on the interior of that defensive line should be hard to handle. And then you got guys like Stephon Green, and you hope Vic Burley can stay healthy and finally get the opportunities to show why he was so highly regarded coming out of high school. You get Helton on one end and TJ Parker on the other, and keep your fingers crossed those two guys stay healthy. Because if one of them goes down, you're right back in the same spot you were in last year. Albeit, a guy like Lawson's year more experience, probably learned a lot of lessons last year and a lot of playing time he had, but you want to stay healthy there, absolutely. I already see somebody's asking about Shavar Young. Yeah, that if you really follow recruiting, the stuff that's come out about Shavar Young in the last week should not be all that surprising. He's never, matter of fact, I wrote a little blurb on it last night. I think they published it on the site sometime earlier today, but he's never really ever shut it down. Just totally shut it down. If you follow him on Twitter, and you go back to January, during the contact period when coaches are out and about visiting all these recruits, man, he just kept posting picture after picture of the different coaches that were coming in to see him. And not uncoincidentally, it's a lot of the teams that you heard in that report the other day from the Rivals guy. SMU. I remember Dan Lanning from Oregon went by and saw him. think coaches from Michigan. I can't remember if coaches from Notre Dame were there, but he made it a point to publicize those things. And I had a conversation with him, I want to say back in February, kind of after the contact period, it kind of stopped and coaches were back off the road. And he talks about how, he's fully logged in. But there have been well over 200 players already decommit in the 2026 class. It will be a miracle, probably. It's just the era we live in. It'll probably be a miracle for Clemson to get from now until signing day in December and not have at least lose one. And you're likely to lose a couple. And I'm not talking about anybody specifically. It's just the era we live in. Particularly the later you get into the cycle, and some schools have missed on guys they really want, and they start offering probably more money than they otherwise would have to flip a guy. That's just kind of how some of these things play out. But if I had to bet on, which one, or at least the first one would be, it would be Young, because he's kind of been flirting with these other schools going back to January, at least. The other downside to that is you didn't take any corners in the last class because you lost the ones you had. You want to take 3 in this class. You're only at 2 right now. So if you were to lose one, you're down to 1 after not having taken any last class. If you end up not meeting your number, getting what you want to get, I mean, that's a position where you might have to look to the portal next year, depending on who leaves, who comes back, and where you're at. But again, man, that's the world we live in now. It's going to be harder and harder to keep guys on board or to keep your entire class intact from the starting point to the ending point. There's just so many different ways to entice them now, as opposed to 5 years ago. Kids are picking schools for different reasons now. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So, I mean, it's just going to get a little harder. Yeah, I saw the tweet about Naheem Burrows shutting down. I've not really heard. He's not anybody I really heard anything about. So, I mean, he wasn't really on my radar as far as a potential flip or anything. That doesn't mean that other teams haven't been after him. I'm sure they have. When a guy comes out, I mean, that there will be examples of players who have no intention of flipping, not just at Clemson, but at other schools too, of players who are committed, have no intention of flipping and coming out and saying, hey, I'm shutting it down, just to try and probably curb some of the contact they're getting. I know, let's use Amari Adams, for example. I know late last year, his phone was burning up, pretty much every day, with teams trying to flip him. I know that happened with Darian Mayo, just teams burning him up, trying to flip him. So if you come out and say you're shutting it down, maybe that can curb some of that. But I had not heard anything specifically about Naheem Burrows. I did see the tweet you're referring to, though. Yeah, I saw Dabo was back in Charlotte today, after just leaving last Thursday with the rest of us. But maybe he's trying to get them to stop ignoring the Tigers in the draft. Hey, I'd say these days it is beneficial that Carolina ignores Clemson players in the draft. I mean, who wants to go play for an organization that poorly run, that bad? It's just, I have actually heard some things from a guy that used to play there, man, and it's he didn't have anything good to say about him. Nothing. So maybe it's a good thing they're not drafting Clemson players. Randall will be a load at 240 and still running 4.4. Yeah, I'm telling you, man, he's one of the players I'm most anxious to see. They're I've seen a couple of comments on Twitter. I've seen a couple on Facebook about how, it's just so hard for wide receivers to turn into running backs. And I just say, look at the guy at SMU last year. He did it. Almost had 2,000 all-purpose yards. So, I mean, it's not like it can't be done. And again, I've said this 100 times. I've heard nothing but positive things. I'm not saying that I heard it was all smooth sailing from the day he, made the move, that there's not been any bumps in the road, but I've heard he's made the transition pretty seamlessly. And that the further he's gotten into it, the better he's gotten. So he's one of the guys that I'm most anxious to see. Clemson listed, I want to say Clemson listed him at 230 or 235 last year. I was thinking they listed him at 225, but I went back and looked it up after Klubnik said that the other day. But yeah, he will be a load to bring down. I don't know if he's still running 4.4 after having both those knees worked on, but your point remains valid. How do I interpret Rump's comments on Mayo? Sound like he's still green and may not be ready for number 2, or maybe he just has to show out in August. That's kind of how I took him. I actually had a conversation with Will last week while we were in Charlotte about this very thing. He took it differently than I did. I actually wrote a story on the comments that Rumpf made about Mayo. And to me, it kind of sounded like maybe he's not quite there yet. But Vandervoort heard something else. So it just goes to show you how two people can listen to the same thing and hear two completely different things. And Rump talked about this too, but with Mayo being 6'7" and playing end, it's one of the hardest things is going to be, having to learn to play with leverage at that height. Not letting linemen get up under him and, take advantage of his height. And Rump said that's something he's still learning to do. He's got to get to the point where he's not thinking about it. He's just doing it. But the fact that they brought Helt in and you still got Lawson there and even Denoff to an extent, that if he does kind of need one more year before he's really ready to roll, having those guys in place will allow them to do that, assuming they can stay relatively healthy. He's a 3-star on every site. He's not worth the bidding war. Clemson's not going to be getting into all these bidding wars to start with. I'm not saying they'll never, that it's always, take it or leave it and there's not any wiggle room or anything like that. But they're not going to get into these back and forth bidding wars. And I am a big believer in Mike Reed and his ability to identify talent. And if Mike Reed thinks a guy's good, and they were in on Shavar early, So that tells me, that Mike Reed saw something in him long ago. If they were in on him that early, I think the kid can play. I don't care if he's got 3 stars, 4 stars, 5 stars. But is he worth? I don't know I don't know that there are a ton of players out there that are worth getting into bidding wars over. Not in this era. Not when you can, even to me, I don't think Bryce Perry Wright's a guy that's worth getting into a bidding war over. Not if the price tag is as high as I've heard. You can go get 2 experienced, established guys out of the portal for that same price. I just you got to decide what you think a guy's worth, and if somebody's willing to come in and pay him way more than that, then yeah, you got to let them walk. Particularly when we're talking about high school freshmen. So if decommits are the new norm, then the staff has to keep recruiting then, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's always kind of been that way, but you have to do it even a little more now. And yes, you can imagine how frustrating it is for college coaches in this era. It's a big part of why Nick Saban no longer coaches. But yeah, you gotta stay on them. But it's always been that way to a degree. You can't just secure a commitment from a guy in March and, not stay on him through the end of the year. Even 10 years ago, somebody would have plucked that guy away doing that. But yeah, I'm sure it does lead to, I don't, it leads to more work for the staff. Absolutely. You got guys who you think are solidly locked in. And I just don't know that anybody's 100%, shouldn't say anybody, but I think there are far fewer players that are 100% solidly locked in these days than anybody. Assuming we are an afterthought, but any smoke on Derek. Clemson's got 6 offensive linemen and do not plan to take a 7th. So there will be no smoke there. Again, you gotta start thinking about this thing like NFL teams manage their rosters under the salary cap. Clemson's got X amount of dollars to spend each year. You got to decide how much you want to devote to the offensive line. And with 6 players already committed, Clemson's hit that number. And especially when you're talking about a 5-star, he's not going to be cheap to start with. So if you go over that amount you have allotted for the offensive line, then you're taking money away from another position. And I just don't see them doing it. And again, I've been told they're not taking a 7th. Putting you on the spot today, Clemson or LSU. Clemson right now. Just feel like we have a fairly good advantage on the line of scrimmage. The boys actually sound laser focused too. They really do sound laser focused. I have gotten a very good vibe. When I've been up there, I got the same feeling in Charlotte last week. It's just there's a little different kind of energy in the air. But I've been saying for weeks that I think Clemson's going to beat LSU. It's I just I don't like the approach LSU's taking here with some of the smack talk. Particularly Brian Kelly and the Death Valley stuff. I think there was one player for LSU at media days, their SEC media days the other day, talking about how Clemson wasn't going to be able to cover their wide receivers and stuff. I mean, I prefer the approach Clemson's taking. You know, they're not really getting caught up in any of that stuff. About the most we heard any players say last week. And there were some reporters asking about it, trying to get them to bite on some of that stuff, and they wouldn't. You know, about as much as you got was Peter Woods saying you could, you know, Google who had Death Valley first. But the mantra basically was, we'll see you on August 30th. But, yeah, I think LSU's got some questions along that offensive line. So I definitely give, you know, Clemson's got experience in the trenches, both sides. I think Clemson's got an edge on the line of scrimmage, offense, defense. And LSU's got their quarterback's really good. They got really good wide receivers. That's probably going to be a high-powered offense. But if that defense, you know, gets back to playing discipline the way they've been known to play up until last year, then yeah, I just don't think this is a game Clemson's going to lose. They've lost 2 openers in a row. Both of them's been away from home, but they've lost 2 in a row. This would be number 3 if they didn't win it. You know, there's something different about this team, man, and it's probably due to all the experience they have coming back, and you know, those guys getting a little bit of just a little tiny taste of the playoff last year. And I think last year was a good learning experience for a lot of those guys, and I think a lot of them are really hungry. And again, I love the approach they're taking. Any word on why Clemson hasn't made a move on Aiden Gibson? He is the number 1 running back in the state. Yeah, I can tell you. Because they're all in on Segura, who, you know, a lot of other people, you know, would argue with you about who the number 1 back in the state is, but they right now they've only offered Segura. He's the guy they want. He's at the top of the board, and for right now they're going to ride with him. A philosophy that did not work well in the 26 class when they started this, you know, after, you know, they had offered Javian Mallory, Carson Baker, Jay Lamar. Mallory committed to Miami almost right after Clemson offered. So then they offered Baker, Lamar. Baker decides he's not even going to give Clemson an official, so they decide to ride it out with Lamar. So that philosophy did not work well in this 26 class. We'll see what happens when they expand the board. There's another kid out of Georgia. Golly, and his name's escaping me right now. He was at camp last month. I know Clemson's been recruiting him. I just cannot remember what the heck his name is. I'll probably remember it as soon as we're done here. But he's a 4-star guy out of Georgia. I just cannot remember his name. What's up with the social media stuff about Dre Quinn wearing Georgia gloves the other day? Look, man, players wear gloves they're free. I saw, you know, Amari Adams was wearing LSU stuff after he had told Clemson coaches he was coming to Clemson. It's not all that uncommon. It could have been something that was handed out at 7-on-7 event he was at. Who knows? There could be 100 different things for that. I mean, I've not really heard anything about Dre flirting with, or Quinn flirting with Georgia. But yeah, I saw it. Will Woods be on the field more? He lost weight, but is it does his so I mean, are you saying he's lazy? Look, I think Woods put on some bad weight last year, but I don't know that I'd say he was one of those guys that takes plays off and those kind of things. I've never really questioned his motor. Maybe maybe you see something I didn't see that made you question it. I've never really seen anything that made me question his motor. I've seen him get frustrated. Frustration can lead to some bad habits and some bad tendencies, but I don't know that I'd be one to say his motor needs to run more. Not in terms of output, obviously, but does Randall look like Herschel Walker to you when he runs upright, a bit stiff, ends up being faster than he looks like he's running mostly north-south? I mean, I can't say that I've gotten Herschel Walker vibes off of him. Being 6'4", though, he's or 6'3" or whatever he is, he's probably going to look like he's running a little more upright than some of these guys. I tell you what, ask me again next week. That's something I'll make sure I pay attention to when we go to practice Thursday and Friday. But I've not had a ton of opportunity to really see him. We didn't get to see much of him in the spring game. Just a little bit we saw against Texas. I saw him do some drills back in the spring, but nothing real. To me, of the backs that on the roster that I've noticed that run too upright, to me it would be easy. I did hear that Peyton Strecco. I'm about to forget another now. I did hear that Peyton Strecco is going on scholarship. Thoughts on Danny Odom maybe flipping? Not really. We'll see. Even if he does, I wouldn't, as a Clemson fan, I would not get my hopes very high. That was one that he looks like it's playing out one way, and then all of a sudden, right there at the end, bam, he goes to Nebraska, just out of the blue almost. Most of the time when one plays out that way, it's for a particular reason. If Odom was to open things back up, and if you're Clemson, you want to keep that line of communication open, obviously, but I just never got the feeling that he was as high on Clemson as maybe Ohio State or I forget the other school that was recruiting him hard, or that was up there for him. If he flips, it'll probably be because somebody came in and offered him something more lucrative than Nebraska did. And I don't know that Clemson's going to do that. No, I'm not gonna dive into the stuff at Daniel. I've seen the video. I'll just say, man, they've got some issues there at Daniel. It sounds, based on some things I've heard, some things I've read, it sounds like there's some issues there at Daniel that need to be figured out and straightened out. And they just, if I'm not mistaken, I don't live in the upstate, so don't hold me to this, but if I'm remembering right, they've got a first-year head coach, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I know they at least got some new assistants because they just had, a little bit of controversy with that coaching staff last season. But it doesn't sound like, based on a couple of and rumors I've heard and some stuff I've seen on social media, it doesn't sound like this was a one-off if you want to go back a few years. Key to beating LSU is getting to their QB. Absolutely. He cannot allow him to get comfortable in the pocket. If he has too much time, there's no way Clemson's defensive backs will hold up that long in coverage because those wide receivers are just too good. I don't know of any secondary that would. They're just, they're just so fast. They got 3 of them that can fly. You got to disrupt his time, and you got to make him uncomfortable. And you can't leave him any open lanes to escape. You got to keep him contained. That was a big problem for Clemson last year. That's something they got to get straightened out. I feel like this team is full of themselves. Good Lord, man. I don't know why you say that either. I thought they were pretty, they were given every opportunity to trash talk back, and none of them took the bait. It was all pretty. I mean, all you got from any of those players was pretty much straight coach speak. I don't know what else you want from them. I lost count of how many times I heard that either Woods or Parker or even Antony say, we got to go do it. We got to go do it. We got to go do it. I didn't really hear anybody that was overly confident or overly full of themselves. They can't help the hype they're getting. That's not their fault. The way they handle it will determine how much success they have this year. And you are the first person that I have seen or heard say that they think the hype's going to their heads. Not sure why players commit, and if committed, why they only shut down the other schools from contacting them. Guess the times have changed. When will Dabo tell recruits to shut down these visits to other schools? Well, first of all, if you're committed to Clemson, you're not allowed to take officials to other schools. That is a rule that is in place. So what we're talking about is something different. And there's it's been going on forever. Even if a player commits, that's not stopping other schools from continuing to recruiting. Some kids decide to shut it down. Other kids don't. Some kids have a hard time telling these coaches no, so they listen to it knowing they're never going to decommit and go somewhere else. In this era, with all the money that's involved, you can't fault a kid for not totally shutting it down and leaving themselves open to hearing other offers. If one school's offering you $500,000 and you commit, and another school comes in 6 weeks later and says, "Hey, we'll give you $2 million," you got to listen to that. Particularly if you're one of these kids that comes from a poor family and your family could use that money right now. That's life-changing money. And, that's not what a lot, not most of these kids aren't getting $2 million deals, but some of them are. It's a low percentage of guys that play college football to go on and have successful NFL careers. I see both sides of it. There'll always be those guys that, hey, I know I want to go here. If I get an offer from here, I'm committing, and that's where I'm going. There'll always be those guys. But on the other side of that, there's going to be guys that, they're going to be open to listening to some of these other offers. What's up with Rabun Gap? Yeah, I can't answer that one. But they got some dudes there. They brought a bunch of guys from Rabun Gap to camp last month there at Clemson. I mean, it was like I want to say like 20 something of them, maybe. I can't remember the number. But it was a bunch of them, and they had some dudes, man, some absolute dudes. I don't know if it's a mini IMG or what's going on there. They got the defensive back, the tall defensive back. I forget his name. That Mickey Khan was recruiting a little bit. Somebody else too. I forget who it was, but it's a couple of players Clemson's been in contact with over there. But yeah, they had some guys come through camp last month that at least from a physical stature, certainly looked the part. How do they expect to keep Clemson fans off the field until all visiting players have left? Well, the fans will either do it or the tradition will get scrapped. That's going to be your choices. If the fans cannot show any patience and wait until they're told they're allowed to come on the field, this will be the last year of gathering at DePaul. Guarantee it. Clemson's not going to be willing to keep paying those fines, week after week after week, year after year after year. I got some opinions on that, but I'll keep them to myself. But, if they're not able to, go by the guidelines that are going to be put in place, then they'll have to do away with the tradition. And, guess who's, Clemson will easily be able to say, hey, we tried, we told y'all how to do it, and y'all weren't willing to do it, and now we got to do away with it. But if they can pull it off and, the fans stay in the stands until they're allowed to come on the field, legally, shouldn't be any issues. But I have my doubts about that myself, my man. I have plenty of doubts about that. Because, technically, they're already supposed to wait. They already come on the field quicker than they're supposed to. There's no, fines for it or anything like that. But, 9 times out of 10, they're on that field faster than they should be. I'm very interested to see how that ends up playing out, because I wholeheartely believe, and I'm not saying anybody's told me this or anything. I just wholeheartedly believe that if, it can't be done in a way where Clemson doesn't get fined, then if they start stacking up some fines, I got a feeling this will be the last year. Sounds like Tom Allen speaking when some of these players speak. That's kind of the tone. That's kind of the feeling I get. It's almost like listening to him talk. For all you guys who always say you want your defense to take on the personality of his coordinator, well, there you go. I think you're starting to see some of that with him. Saw Easy signed with Jay-Z agent company. Any thoughts on that? Can't see Spiller's running back room keeping all these guys after 25 seasons. I don't really have any thoughts on that. Come next year, Adam Randall's going to be gone. There will be plenty of opportunities for Easy to play in 26. Plenty. I thought Clemson was lucky not to lose one or two of those running backs before this season, after last year. And it had nothing to do with who represented any of them. It's just because there's so many guys in that room. There's no way you could get them all opportunities. And there's probably a couple in there that could probably benefit from maybe dropping down a little. And, that's just my opinion. But, it's hard to keep a roster in place these days. Clemson's been better at it than anybody else. Seems like the thought is beat LSU or bust. We know this team is probably losing to, hate saying it, but LSU could very well be one. See, I don't see anybody saying it's beat LSU or bust. I think that's an asinine point of view, man. Your season's far from over if you lose to LSU. I could easily see this team losing 2 games, in the regular season, still winning the ACC, still making the playoff. At the end of the day, that's the goal, making the playoff. You don't have to beat LSU to do that. 2 years ago, absolutely. The LSU game is much bigger. The playoff implications are much bigger. But now that we're under this 12-team format and the conference champions get automatic bids, I don't see why anybody would think it's LSU or bust or beat LSU or bust. That doesn't make any sense to me. What happens if a few boneheads run to the paw early but not a crowd? My guess would be if a few boneheads did it, everybody else would follow. But if you're talking like if 4 or 5 run out there and everybody else stays, to me, that's not storming or crowd storming or anything. I don't know how you could get fined for that. You never know these days, but to me, if you had that issue and it's only like a small number, you catch them and ban them. Does Tom Allen give off BV vibe, same intensity? I don't think anybody's as intense at Venables. I just don't. I think any defensive coordinator that comes through Clemson now is always going to have this standard to live up to, and it's going to be this standard, or at least from a lot of fans, it's going to be this standard with very unrealistic expectations just because, of the legacy Venables left. There's also been some revisionist history there too. Venables defenses didn't come out and shut everybody down every week, 1 week after the next. As good as they were, and boy, man, were they good. They did have some issues from time to time too. Not a ton of times, but they still had some issues time to time. But if you're talking about, if you like intensity, you'll like Tom Allen. He's high energy, very high energy. Personal opinion will be a success for a Tom Allen defense this year. Safety concerns me some, but have top 10, 15 defense expectations. I think it's I'll be disappointed if Clemson doesn't finish in the top 20 in defense. Absolutely. There's too much talent on that side of the ball to not be like night and day better than they were last year. Yeah, you got to replace R.J. Mickens, but I mean, you got some options there. You got Khalil. Well, let's just put it this way: when Mickey Barnes was asked about replacing R.J. Mickens, he talks about Khalil Barnes sliding into that spot. But you got guys like Ricardo Jones, who really got his feet wet a good bit last year and flashed when he did. I mean, that guy's a ball hawk. You got. Hold on, let me pull this thing up here because I don't want to leave anybody off. Oh, yeah. You got Kylan Griffin, who's played a lot for you, who's going to be a year more experienced. I think Noah Dixon's a guy that can make a little bit of noise this year. And I wouldn't discount Ronan Hannafin either. I heard a lot of good things about him in the spring. So we'll see what kind of opportunities he gets. But I understand why people would have questions about the back end of the defense, particularly the way, the corners played some down the stretch. I just think there were a lot of things happening off the field that went into the product we saw on the field. I'm not saying that was the only thing. I'm just saying I think that played a big part in it. I think it started to get to a point where some of the stuff that Wes was wanting to do just, he was starting to overload stuff or overload players on the defense, man. And you don't want guys overthinking. How many times have you heard one of those defensive guys back in the spring or last week in Charlotte or last week in Charlotte talking about being able to play free and just being able to react and not think. And I think this scheme that Tom Allen's bringing is going to let you do that. Jay Haynes will not be full go for fall camp. All I can tell you is what Dabo said last week or the week before last was that he was progressing. We'll see where he is, a couple weeks into camp, where he is once they get ready to start prep for LSU. But even once he gets fully cleared, he's got to, I've talked about this before too, especially with running backs. Sometimes it takes those guys a little while to get to trusting that knee fully once they've had it repaired or the ACL repaired. So a lot of that's just going to depend on him. Just have to wait and see on that one. How tough of a game will Georgia Tech and Louisville? See, those are landmines and possibly NC State. Yeah, I said last week, week 4 last, probably 2 or 3 different times now that if I had to pick a team right now that I thought Clemson would lose to, it'd probably be that Friday night game in Louisville. I think Jeff Brom is a offensive guru. I think he is one of the best, bright, young, upcoming coaches in the country. And I like some of the things he did in the offseason. And they kind of punked Clemson last year. They came into Clemson and punked Clemson. The game was not as close as the final score would indicate or suggest. But that going into Louisville and playing on a Friday night, and it's the week after you play Florida State, that one could – landmine's a good word to use there. And I definitely don't think Georgia Tech's a team to be overlooked. Key's been doing a lot of good things there. You got a wily veteran quarterback, Haynes King. He's He's got their recruiting on the upswing, heading in the right direction. We'll see how big of a jump Georgia Tech takes this year. But if it's not this year, I think it'll be next year when they really do take a jump. But that game's, that game's week 3. It's LSU, then Troy, I think it is, and then you go to Georgia Tech. Is right off the bat, you're going on the road to Atlanta. If I had to pick one of those games, I'd pick the Louisville game. But and I don't know how good North Carolina State's going to be. I'm personally not very high on them. Hold on a second, I'll tell you where I picked them to finish in the ACC, and it was not better than the middle of the pack. I can tell you that. Well, I'll take that back. I picked them to finish 6th. And that's probably a little higher than I should have. I picked them. Have I cut grass? I cut grass in the heat every time I cut grass, man. What are you talking about? Should have seen my shirt last time I cut grass. Looked like I come out of a swimming pool. Do I have an update on Vic Burley and whether he's healthy? From my understanding, he's ready to roll. That is what I've been led to believe. Anyways, we'll get a better idea of that when we get there Thursday. But assuming that he is fully healthy and that he's ready to roll, this should be the year that he starts to or the light starts to come on. Let's put it that way. I do think injuries have set him back a little bit because he's dealt with some, and I think it probably caused him to put on a little bit of bad weight. We'll see, when they do the weigh-in later this week, we'll get a pretty good idea of I'll have a better idea of what my expectations are for him after that. Let's just say that. But perfect world, and we certainly don't live in a perfect world, but perfect world, if he's fully healthy and ready to go and, he's been putting in the work, you'd like to see him take a big jump and be a consistent part of the rotation and contribute this year. Not just, come on and play less than 100 snaps. Especially the way Clemson likes to rotate those defensive linemen, particularly the tackles. Think Duke's going to be better than they're getting credit for too. Yep. This kind of surprises me here because I thought I did it the other way around, but I picked Duke 7th. I was thinking I picked Duke ahead of North Carolina, one spot ahead of North Carolina State, but I actually slotted North Carolina State 6th, Duke 7th. Here's the way I voted. I voted Clemson to win the ACC, Louisville 2nd, SMU 3rd, Miami 4th, Georgia Tech 5th, NC State 6th, Duke 7th, Florida State 8th, Syracuse 9th, Pittsburgh 10th, the Tar Heels 11th, Virginia Tech 12th, Cal 13th, Stanford 14th, Boston College 15th, Virginia 16th, and Wake Forest pulling up the rear at 16th. So, yeah, I think we got a good idea of what Duke can be under Manny Diaz last year. They were a lot better than most people thought they'd be coming in. But I really like what Brett Key's doing at Georgia Tech. I think he's got that program headed in the right direction. they've had some recruiting wins, man, some big ones. Let's see here. If I can get it to come up without having to wait too long. You go back to the last recruiting class, man, they won out on Josh Petty. They had a top 25 class. They flipped Tay Harris from Clemson, who I am extremely high on. I think that kid's going to be a really good football player. They got the defensive lineman Christian Garrett. I mean, the offensive lineman Peyton Joseph. I mean, Brent Key had some big recruiting wins in the last class. Don't know that they've done quite as well so far in the 26 cycle. Their highest guy, their highest recruits ranked inside the top 250. If you're looking at 24/7 anyways, but he's had some success in the portal too. I think the ACC needs to be proactive and add some Big 12 teams. Utah, TCU, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Arizona State. I think it's too late to be proactive. It'd have been nice if they could have been proactive, several years back and maybe snag some of these teams that have already made a move. But, I'm of the opinion this whole thing is going to blow up. If not for the next television contract, then by the time the next one. So sometime probably in the next decade or so. And when that happens, I don't think none of this stuff's going to matter because I think you're going to see a complete break. Football breaks off from the NCAA, and you have 40, 50, 60, whatever it might be, or ends up being 40, 50, 60 teams kind of break off and go do their own thing. I just think there's just too much money these days and just the world we live in now. I don't know how much longer that the other sports are going to be allowed to, siphon money off of a sport that football players generate. There's going to come a time where some of these players are going to say, hey, man, this revenue we're generating is going to finance a rowing team that loses $500,000 a year. That'll probably get challenged at some point if we don't have a blow up, but I just don't know that the current model is sustainable. I mean, in theory, you'd like to see them do that. I don't know what difference it will make. First and foremost, you have to have a television partner that's willing to push you the way ESPN pushes the SEC or Fox pushes the Big Ten. CBS is already kind of partnered up with the Big Ten now. So, I mean, I just don't know. I just don't know how much it would help. Clemson's schedule is going to be tougher than people think. No, they don't have a cakewalk of a schedule. Absolutely not. Again, you open with LSU. Even the game you play against a G5 team this year is against a G5 team known for being pretty dang good in Troy. Then you go on the road at the upstart Georgia Tech. You get Syracuse at home. You go to North Carolina after that, and I'm of the opinion North Carolina's not going to be very good. I think Belichick said they had 70 new players on that roster the other day. That's a lot of turnover. And then you go to Boston College, and then it really starts to toughen up after that. You get SMU at home. You get a bye week. Then you get Duke. and then Florida State comes in. After that, you go on the road and play Louisville, and on the road and play South Carolina. Yeah, I mean, that's not a cakewalk of a schedule. Particularly if a team like Syracuse or North Carolina or Duke or Florida State ends up being a whole lot better than a lot of people think they're going to be. It gets that much harder. Do I think Louisville can keep Brom? Yeah. You got to remember, that's where he went to school. That's kind of the job he always wanted. So, yeah, I think they can keep him. Does Tony Elliott lose his job? I think that's a distinct possibility if they don't, make some. They probably were better than most thought they'd be last year, but you got to keep heading in a upper. You got to keep heading in the right direction and not take a step back. And I don't know if he's going to be able to avoid doing that. As bad as the wide receiver room was in 2020, it's hard to believe Tyler Brown is wide receiver number 4. Have to actively try not to. Yeah. It's they've been on the struggle bus with the receivers for, a couple of reasons, or, for multiple reasons. They've had some highly rated guys come through and just not pan out. They've had that room, just ravaged by injury on multiple occasions. For me, the bigger thing is just missing on some guys, missing on a few, to be quite honest. It does appear they've kind of got that thing turned around a little bit, heading back in the right direction. You've got, obviously I think Antonio coming back was huge because he kind of, he's kind of turned into the go-to guy for Cade. And when you need a play, that's who Cade tends to look at. Then you got those two guys that were freshmen last year, Brett Wesco and Moore. And now they've had a year to build some chemistry with Klubnik. Tyler Brown is back healthy. He's had a year to build some, he had his year as a freshman to build some chemistry with Klubnik. Even Cole Turner's got some chemistry with Klubnik. So you got 5 guys in that wide receiver room that have all had at least, 1 year playing with Klubnik. And then you bring in a Tristan Smith, who caught 70-something balls last year, almost 1,000 yards or over 900 yards. I think it's a wide receiver room that ranks right up there with some of the better ones in the country. I'm not going to say it's the best wide receiver room in the country. I know I've heard some others say that. I don't know if I'd go that far, but I do think it kind of ranks right up there with some of the better ones. And it's definitely one of the better ones they've had, probably going back to 2018, 2017, something like that. It's been a quick minute. It's been a little bit. Dabo was asked the two transfers he really didn't want to lose recently. He said Makuba and Hoffler, who went to Georgia. That would be my two. I was always kind of high on AJ Hoffler. He was a guy that needed some time. He needed a year or two to to develop. And he saw I don't know what he saw at Georgia Tech, but Makuba, I know he gets accused a lot about of chasing the bag, but there were a lot. There were some things that went into that just hasn't gotten talked about publicly. Hardly at all. That has nothing to do with money. I just think it was probably the right move for him personally. But yeah, you see what after he got fully healthy and he was back playing where in his natural position. Yeah, you see exactly what he could do. His last season at Clemson, man, he was banged up, never fully healthy. They had to move him out the corner, and that's not where he's going to shine. Thought we was going to lose Sammy Brown after that South Carolina game. Sammy Brown never wavered. Never. What did Makuba say? I heard him say he wasn't developed. Look, man, sometimes you just gotta. You can either always take what these guys say publicly at face value, or you gotta learn that sometimes, they're just gonna say what needs to be said. But there were some personal things going on with Makuba that factored into that. Man, he had a little baby. His family was back in Texas. That's his story to tell, but it was not all about being developed. Matter of fact, I personally don't think that played any role in it. But it's the easy answer. I don't know if you also heard Dabo talk about Andrew Makuba, last year in the lead up to the Texas game or right after it. Not an ounce of hard feelings about anything Makuba said on the way out. Got to be a reason why. What do I think they would do at running back, D end, and recruiting? I don't know that we'll see if they decide to add another defensive end. I'm not convinced they will. I don't know about running back yet. I know Jay Allen Terry's a guy that they've kept in contact with. They told him they wanted to see some more film this year before they offered. I'm not even 100% sure that they know which direction they're going to go at running back yet. I guess that's the same thing you're asking me about recruiting, running back recruiting. Yeah, we'll get a better idea once the season gets started. Again, I'm not 100% certain they know which direction that thing's going to go yet. Fortunately, they're coming off a class in which they just brought in Gideon, so you don't necessarily have to hit on some big time guy that needs to come in and play immediately, but you'd like to get a guy that can at least contribute a little bit and help himself out a little bit as a freshman. Because I'm not sure you're going to keep all those guys in that room after this year. All right, man. Before we get out of here, I want to thank my fellas over there at A Glass. It's been a Long-time sponsor for the show. Matter of fact, I forgot to give them a shout out at the beginning. I've had a long day, man. Everything's been thrown out of whack today. But if you live in Florence, man, and you got any auto glass needs, check them out. A-Glass. They do replacement. They do repair. All your auto glass needs. They've been in business a long time. Kind of a lot of them migrated over from Turner's Auto Glass when Turner's used to be in business back in the day. But, man, really good people. 2 locations. One in Florence, one in Sumter. The one in Florence is right over there by the Walmart on Urban Street. One in Sumter's 3325 Carter Road. And you can get a free quote, myaglass.com. Fall camp starts Thursday. Should be a lot to discuss starting next Monday and all the way through the rest of the year. You know, I know it's been a long time. You know, we've talked a lot of baseball since the end of the football season, particularly since the start of February. But we're getting really, really, really close now, man. And I've got a bunch of guys on here. And I think I'm even fairly certain I got a couple of gals on here, too, that tune in regularly, man. I want to say thank you to everybody, even the ones that just tune in from time to time, ones that just tuning in for the first time. Very much appreciated. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a like, hit that subscribe button. And here's a reminder. If you do tune in regularly and you like to comment, because I need to say this more often and I forget. You like my use of the word gals there? Yeah. If you're watching on Facebook and you want to comment, you've got to, if you don't comment on the post on the actual Clemson Insider Facebook page, I'm not going to see it. If you just comment like where it's shared in a group, if you comment under in that group, it doesn't show up. So make sure you comment. And if you want it to be seen anyways, make sure you're commenting either under the YouTube feed or under the TCI Facebook feed. And they don't show up on Twitter either, if I'm not mistaken. So one of those two. Again, I want to thank our sponsor over at A-Glass. You can get yourself a free quote, myaglass.com. Check us out. We'll have a lot of stuff on the site from the start of fall camp, ClemsonInsider.com. And, of course, right back here, 7 o'clock next Monday.